Hi, I'm Lynn Boland, Director and Chief Curator of the Gregory Alucard Museum of Art at Colorado State University. And this is a video presentation in lieu of a live lecture originally scheduled to take place in the museum's Robert W. Hoffert Learning Center. I'm giving it in conjunction with the temporary traveling exhibition, Cercle Carré and the International Spirit of Abstract Art, organized by the Georgia Museum of Art at the University of Georgia. The exhibition is currently in our Griffin Foundation Gallery, but closed to the public because of the coronavirus pandemic. I'm also presenting video gallery talks of that exhibition, looking at the international abstractionist group Cercle Carré, Circle and Square, based in Paris in 1929 and 1930, co-founded by Pierre Daura, Joaquin Torres Garcia, and Michel Soufor. The group included participants from Western and Eastern Europe, Russia, North and South America, and abstract artists such as Piet Mondrian, Sophie Teuber-Arp, and Vasily Kandisnky. I'd like to thank the Daura Foundation for making our presentation of the exhibition and related programming possible. This talk draws on my doctoral dissertation undertaken at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'd like to thank my entire committee and the entire department there, but especially my advisor, Dr. Linda Henderson. This body of research might be broadly described as a study of perceived connections between art and music in late 19th and early 20th century Europe. But in itself, this is far too broad to offer much real meaning. I struggle to think of any member of the European avant-garde who didn't make musical references of some sort at some point. And connections between art and music can be traced back to the ancient world, from the metaphorical to the mathematical to multimodal art forms. But by the end of the 19th century, music was increasingly being used as an analog for the formal qualities of art. Now, the basic premise is simple enough. As an inherently abstract medium, music is an ideal model for the formal qualities of art, color, and form. Whether the images are naturalistic, abstracted, or, as they would become in the 20th century, totally abstract. So this basic idea has been clear enough, but it's somewhat unsatisfying. Music served as a metaphor, but the scholarly literature on the period suggested it did more. For Vasily Kandisnky especially, scholars made convincing arguments that the artist drew on musical models more directly and based on Kandinsky's own statements, but nothing more specific was offered. How exactly were musical ideas adapted to visual form by early 20th century artists, particularly Kandinsky? And among artists of the period, Kandisnky was one of the most vocal in his advocacy of music as a source for art. In what would become a seminal text for abstract art theory, Über das Geistige in der Kunst, on the spiritual in art, of 1911, he wrote, "The richest lessons are to be learned from music." However, he also wrote, quote, "I do not want to paint music," end quote. So it's probably more complicated than a direct translation, say, of a musical score into a visual image. Now, to give just a quick biographical sketch, Kandinsky was born in 1866 in Moscow. He studied law before abandoning it for a career in art. He moved to Munich, Germany in 1896, and there he participated in a number of avant-garde movements before co-founding Der Blaureiter, the Blue Rider group with Franz Marc in 1911. Kandisnky later taught at the Bauhaus School from 1923 to 1933. And the Bauhaus was a school of applied and integrated arts founded by the architect Walter Gropius, first in Weimar, then Dessau, Germany. And Kandinsky's musical interest would remain apparent. For instance, his Bauhaus publication From Point and Line to Plane of 1926, where it's expressed especially clearly. This leitmotif of visual music continued when he moved to Paris in 1934, and he died in 1944. So there are any number of opportunities to consider Kandinsky's engagement with musical ideas, but I wanted to explore how these ideas might have contributed to his initial formation of an abstract visual idiom in the years immediately before World War I. As you can tell from the title of this talk, much of it hinged on the notion of dissonance and atonality. Now, my general method might be described most simply as having started with a close examination of visual material, close readings of the artist's texts. These provided clues for an investigation of related themes within the cultural context of the era. The key areas for me included science, especially physics, and the emerging field of experimental psychology. Spiritual and occult literature figured prominently, and this was often closely related to the science of the time. Philosophy, some aesthetics, but really more the metaphysics of continental philosophers. And of course, art theory, criticism, that of the visual arts and music, but also theater and literature. So recovering this context then provided new insights for the analysis of both text and image, and it allowed at least one fairly concrete example of how musical theories of dissonance and atonality served as a source for abstract painting. Now, of course, it was neither that clean nor that easy. It was a constant back and forth and reevaluation of a wealth of materials. But that was the general process, I'd say, on both a macro and micro level. These two paintings largely bookend my research on Kandisnky. Impression 3, Concert of 1911, and Composition 7 of 1913. I should offer a quick note on Kandisnky's terminology for his paintings, impression versus improvisation versus composition. He wrote that direct impressions of external nature expressed in a drawing or painting, I call these impressions. Now, his use of the term impression should not be confused with the term impressionism, a style designation coined in the 1870s. Kandisnky really intended it in a way consistent with its colloquial use, an impression of an actual scene or event. Now, events of a spiritual type, he named improvisations, and he called his most carefully planned paintings compositions. Now, note the musical connotations of his terminology, something common throughout Kandisnky's writings. Kandisnky's abiding interest in music was the primary reason for my focus, but it proved to have far-reaching implications. Recovering broader issues of the connections suggested between art and music through the lens of Kandisnky's art and theory has not only helped to explain Kandisnky's application of musical ideas, it also illuminated a cross-disciplinary interest in the musical notion of dissonance throughout this cultural milieu. An existing paradigm of musical harmony, applied broadly to philosophical and scientific systems, was being adapted in the early 20th century, reflecting changing attitudes towards dissonant music of late 19th century Romanticism and early 20th century atonality. My research explores how these ideas contributed to Kandisnky's initial formation of an abstract visual idiom in the years immediately before World War I. As the artist wrote in On the Spiritual in Art, clashing discords, loss of equilibrium, principles overthrown, opposites and contradictions, this is our harmony. Scholars looking at Kandisnky's interest in music have focused almost exclusively on Austrian composer Arnold Schoenberg. It's with good cause, I'll readily admit, but it's worth pointing out that Schoenberg was not his only friend within musical circles. The musician and composer Thomas von Hartmann was a close associate in Munich and contributed much to his understanding of new musical trends. However, it was a concert of Schoenberg's music performed in Munich on January 2nd, 1911, that would serve as a catalyst for a vitally important vein of Kandisnky's theories of abstract art. He began this painting the following day, on January 3rd, 1911, Impression 3, Concert. This event would spark a key moment in his breakthrough into total abstraction, but the painting is not yet an embodiment or a reflection of the ideas at the heart of that breakthrough, so those are still to come. This painting does serve as an excellent example of Kandisnky's means of abstracting his subjects at the time. And the seminal scholarship on the artist remains that of Rose Carroll Washington Long. And as Long described, there's a veiling and stripping in Kandisnky's initial drive to abstract, which is evident here. And this was part of his larger path to abstraction. The 1911 concert included String Quartet in D minor, Opus 10, the last movement of which is atonal, and Schoenberg's Opus 11, 3 piano pieces, his first fully atonal score. As another aside, we've recently presented the Music in the Museum concert series talk and performance originally scheduled to take place in the gallery as a video, and it features a brilliant performance of Schoenberg's 3 piano pieces by Dr. Joel Bacon from Colorado State University's School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Okay, back to January 1911. Kandisnky wrote to Schoenberg a few weeks after the concert, initiating a long-term friendship. As I suggested earlier, scholars seeking to better understand Kandisnky's interest in music have looked to connect this painting to Schoenberg's theories. And the concert of Schoenberg's music is clearly the visual source, the subject of the painting. But attempts to find connection between the painting and the music itself have been stymied. And here, too, there is good cause. As I noted, it was begun only a day after Kandisnky's first encounter with Schoenberg's music. And Schoenberg's publication Theory of Harmony hadn't been released yet. Kandisnky only had access to a brief excerpt, which had appeared in a promotion for the concert. Now, the initial letters between the two strongly suggest that Kandisnky, in fact, initially misunderstood a key passage of the excerpt of Schoenberg's writings that he had seen, centered around Schoenberg's term remote consonances. Schoenberg wrote, "Dissonances are only different from consonances in degree. They are nothing more than more remote consonances. Today, we have already reached the point where we no longer make the distinction between consonances and dissonances, or at most we make the distinction that we are less willing to use consonances. I believe that it will eventually be possible to recognize the same laws in the harmony of those of us the most modern as in the harmony of the classics, but suitably expanded." In a letter to Arnold Schoenberg, dated January 18, 1911, Kandisnky offered a paraphrase. "Today's dissonance in painting and music is merely the consonance of tomorrow." Kandisnky is fitting Schoenberg's quote into an evolutionary path to abstraction that he describes in his text for On the Spiritual, where what is initially shocking will gradually become accepted. Schoenberg agreed with this idea, but it's not what he meant by a lessening distinction between consonance and dissonance, or more remote consonances. Rather, he meant that the very system defining consonance and dissonance also suggested that the difference was largely arbitrary. I'll return to this important point. Kandisnky would eventually come to incorporate both interpretations in his writing. And Schoenberg's initial idea would then come to have much greater importance in Kandisnky's art and writings of 1912, 1913. But in 1911, he was very much interpreting the experience of the performance of Schoenberg's music within an artistic model he had already established. Now, this model itself was built around ideas of vibration and harmony, however, would mean that many of Schoenberg's ideas would resonate all the more once Kandisnky came to understand them. In order to understand Kandisnky's intent in Impression 3 concert or later paintings, such as Composition 7, the broader cultural context surrounding this notion of dissonance must be restored. Kandisnky's writings of these years also quickly reveal that while Schoenberg was a significant source, he was by no means alone in advancing ideas about positive and constructive roles of dissonance and this vibrational model of transmission, artistic or otherwise, was widespread. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, notions of musical dissonance were important not only in music theory and acoustics, but also within the nascent field of experimental or Gestalt psychology. The concept of dissonance was simultaneously being defined artistically by music theory, extrinsically by physics, and intrinsically by experimental psychology, to name only 3 spheres of consideration. Moreover, as I noted at the outset, the concept of dissonance already figured into a range of other writings, including philosophy and occult literature, much of which Kandisnky cited in his own books and essays, or that was in his possession during these years. So let's look at what dissonance is. The fundamental mathematical relationship between acoustical tones and harmonies has been the subject of study since at least the ancient Pythagoreans in the 5th century BCE. And Western notions of consonance and dissonance are rooted in this history. In the simplest, most general terms, consonance is a tonal relationship that gives the impression of stability, while dissonance gives the impression of tension. The Pythagoreans found that if a taut string was plucked, then halved, The halved string would produce a new tone whose relationship to the first is what we call an octave. The most consonant interval, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. Other simple ratios dividing the string produce other so-called consonant intervals. So 3-to-2 makes a perfect fifth, 4-to-3 a perfect fourth, 5-to-4 a major third. The exact dividing line between consonance and dissonance was the subject of some debate over the centuries, but certain intervals always fell to one side or the other, like those I just described as consonant intervals, or the minor second, for instance, or the tritone or augmented fourth. To give an example, the interval between C and F sharp. It's part of what's known as the Devil's Triad. So a major chord is very consonant, very stable, easily described as pleasing to the ear, even happy. But a minor chord, often described as sad, is consonant too. The minor third, the differing note between the major and minor chords, is considered an imperfect consonant, but so is the major third. So these ratios are 6-to-5 and 5-to-4, respectively. So this idea of consonance and dissonance shouldn't be confused with major or minor. In Western classical music, dissonance was used to move a composition along, providing tension and resolution. Composers of the 19th century were making increasing use of dissonance in their works, both structurally and expressively, and this rise in dissonant music was largely parallel to the increasingly abstracting tendencies in visual art. In the mid-19th century, the scientist Hermann von Helmholtz greatly refined and expanded knowledge about consonance and dissonance using new technologies available to him. In his publication of 1863, On the Sensations of Tone as a Physiological Basis for the Theory of Music, Helmholtz described the way in which the musical pitches and harmonies employed in traditional Western music were related to overtones, which were in turn the result of sympathetic vibrations or sympathetic resonance. I'll explain. So when an acoustical sound is initiated, a drum is struck, a string is plucked, or struck with one of a piano's 88 internal hammers, sound waves vibrate and radiate outward. The wave's rate of vibration determines the pitch, and as it travels outward, it causes other objects to vibrate. Those secondary vibrations can produce their own sound if the rate of vibration and the object are attuned. Let me give a specific example. Pianos are designed to maximize overtones. A middle A on a piano produces a sound frequency of 440 vibrations per second. The A an octave above it, 880, below it 220. One A can make another vibrate, but it also affects other notes. So this is the overtone series. The most prominent overtone, or harmonic, is the octave, but it's followed by the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth, the major third, the minor third, and so on. So a key point for our purposes is that the Western system of harmony was aligned with the ratios that make up the overtone series. Consonant intervals can be expressed by small integer ratios like 2-to-1 or 4-to-3, while dissonant intervals are more complex, more remote ratios, like the dissonant minor second, a 16-to-15 ratio. The full interaction between Helmholtz's theories and music theory is far more complicated than this, but our takeaway with regard to Schoenberg and later Kandisnky is this idea that, quote, dissonances are only different from consonances in degree. They are nothing more than more remote consonances. So the discovery of Helmholtz also led to many other areas of study and other considerations of dissonance. For instance, those of his student and assistant, Wilhelm Wundt, who is often credited as being the father of experimental psychology. His theories greatly inform music and art theory of the period. I'll note that the scholar John Gage has produced excellent work looking at Wundt's research into vision and how it applied to artists of the era, including Kandisnky. Wundt stressed an interconnection of the senses within the brain even more than Helmholtz had, among other points drawing comparisons between the mechanics of the ear and the eye. He also posited that although there are distinct sensory organs and corresponding regions of the brain, there is, quote, no localized function, and instead exists a simultaneous interconnection of sensory faculties. Importantly, Wundt also studied the interaction of the physics and physiology of dissonance. And there's a lot here, but in brief, in expanding on Helmholtz's study into why dissonance sounds harsh, it's the resultant part of beats that develop because of the interaction of vibrating waves, Wundt identified what he called difference tones, resulting from the difference between the vibrating rates of two tones. Wundt also found that in certain dissonant intervals, the disturbance of beats does not occur continually. Over the course of letting the notes continue, quote, harshness disappears and we have pure dissonance, end quote. All of these ideas would resonate with Kandisnky's art theory circa 1911. And it's likely he knew this work. Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology of 1874 was in its 9th German edition by 1911 and had been translated into Russian by 1900. Moreover, Helmholtz and Wundt's theories were included in many popular science texts, such as Theodor Lipps' Psychological Studies of 1905. Lipps' theories were cited numerous times in Wilhelm Boehringer's influential Abstraction and Empathy of 1907, and Lipps, Boehringer, and Kandisnky were all in Munich in these years. Lipps, like Wundt, was interested in dissonance and in the generative qualities of the more complex ratios of dissonant intervals, as well as studies of the human perception, what he called psychic excitations of musical dissonance. Many of these notions would have appealed to Kandisnky, and there are abundant similarities in On the Spiritual. For instance, Kandisnky describes a desirably discordant relationship between subject and form in a manner similar to Wundt's difference tones, where this dissonance may strengthen the spiritual accord of the work, while a consonant or parallel relationship might, by similarity, destroy it, Kandisnky writes. He writes, it is evident that many colors are hampered and even nullified in effect by many forms. On the whole, keen colors are well suited by sharp forms, e.g. a yellow triangle, and soft deep colors by round forms, e.g. a blue circle. But it must be remembered that an unsuitable combination of form and color is not necessarily discordant, but may, with manipulation, show the way to fresh possibilities of harmony. So this is just part of how the rich history of nascent experimental psychology informs these ideas. There are other important figures here. Gustav Fechner is particularly fascinating. But I want to return to physics very briefly and look at the larger backdrop to Kandisnky's theories. As I noted earlier, these ideas about dissonance were incorporated into a larger model of vibration, consistently employed to describe any kind of artistic or spiritual transmission or communication. This is particularly true in key passages of On the Spiritual, and this metaphor of the piano is central. He wrote, generally speaking, color is a power that directly influences the soul. Color is the keyboard. The eyes are the hammers. The soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand which plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. It is evident, therefore, that color harmony must rest only on a corresponding vibration in the human soul, and this is one of the guiding principles of the inner need. Kandisnky's art theory really hinges on this idea of sympathetic vibrations. Now, many of the scientific theories I've been discussing still hold, or at least laid the groundwork for current understanding, like the basic acoustics I've described. However, other ideas that were then central to the worldview of this period have since been dismissed. For instance, ether physics, which is especially important to understand the full implications here. By ether, I'm not talking about the liquid, the anesthetic. This is the older use of the term. Basically, an invisible substance surrounding us, thought to be responsible for various unseen physical actions. And take magnetism. Two objects are interacting at a distance, so there must be some stuff in between getting pushed or pulled. That's a vast oversimplification, of course. forgive me, science historians of the world. E.T. Whittaker's A History of the Theories of Ether and Electricity, published in 1910, offers a useful summation of the physics of his day, and was written at roughly the same time Kandisnky was writing on the spiritual. Whittaker took as a given that, quote, the ether is the solitary tenant of the universe, save for that infinitesimal fraction of space which is occupied by ordinary matter. This was also intertwined with a debate over light at this time, and whether it's made of particles or energy. And theories of the luminiferous ether and the wave theory of light. Light was a vibration in the ether. As Helmholtz wrote in his popular lectures, light is also an undulation of a peculiar medium, the ether, diffused through the universe, and light, as well as sound, exhibits phenomena of interference. And this is also related to the electrical theory of matter, which Kandisnky discussed on the spiritual. But we'll leave this part of the history here, other than to say that this all contributed to a prevailing trend in European modernism, what scholar Linda Henderson dubbed vibratory modernism, which, among other things, encouraged the notion of sound and light as being more physically related than in our current model of the universe. Now, Albert Einstein's 1905 theory of relativity dismissed the ether, certainly any mechanical function to it. But his theory wasn't widely accepted and not at all popularly known until 1919, when 2 expeditions were made to measure positions of stars during an eclipse. After that, he was a worldwide science superstar, but his theories didn't have any broad impact before 1919. And we're looking at the period between 1911 and 1913. So the science of the day strongly encouraged a vibrational model in conceiving of various interactions. More so, it encouraged a belief in previously unidentified human potential. The unseen was becoming increasingly known, but it was also becoming ever clearer that there are a vast array of unseen vibrations surrounding us. Light is just a small fraction of the larger spectrum, which at this time, to most, was a spectrum of vibrations, again, that included sound as well as light. Whether light or sound or unseen, still unknown vibrations, these were all conceived as vibrations in the ether. Now, turning our attention to the spiritual, theosophy has often been discussed as a source for Kandisnky and others, such as Pete Mondrian, and it'll be useful to touch on it briefly before looking at some of the sources and citations shared between Kandisnky and theosophical literature, a common foundation that offers rich insights into Kandinsky's art theory. Now, very briefly again, in lieu of footnotes, I'll quickly mention that Sixten Ringbaum was the first scholar to explore Kandinsky's involvement with theosophy, and Rose Carroll Washington Long enlarged this work with a specific focus on Rudolf Steiner's interest in the Book of Revelations. Then Linda Henderson recovered much of the scientific context and its connection to occultism and spirituality. And Linda was my advisor at the University of Texas at Austin, and my research drew heavily on hers, expanding certain areas of inquiry around topics of music and dissonance, as you've seen. So, back to theosophy. Might be described as a kind of synthesis of world religions and philosophies with a deep interest in occult and arcane knowledge. The Theosophical Society was founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 19th century. Now, the book Thought Forms by 2 leading theosophists, Annie Besant and Charles Ledbetter, is most often discussed in relation to Kandisnky, and it certainly proved an important source for the artist, especially as an example of the visualization of music. So after examining different thought forms that arise from different feelings, the authors end the book with a trio of images showing the forms created by different musical compositions. And I'll quote the descriptions from the authors here. This form is produced by one of Mendelssohn's Lieder ohne Wörter and is characteristic of the delicate filigree work which so often appears as the result of his compositions. In plate G, we have an entirely different piece, a ringing chorus by Gounod. The golden glory surrounding and interpenetrating it indicates, as before, the radiation of its vibrations, which in this case show the dominant yellow in much greater proportion than did Mendelssohn's gentler music. No one who has devoted any study to these musical forms would hesitate in ascribing the marvelous mountain range depicted in plate W to the genius of Richard Wagner, for no other composer has yet built sound edifices with such power and decision. The coruscations and scintillations of these wondrous astral edifices are far beyond the power of any physical words to describe. Now, let me also quickly note the importance of Gladney plates for these authors, as well as Margaret Watts Hughes' voice figures, which recorded vibrational patterns that she had formed, and she was a singer and educator. She made these on her Edophone. So all of these sources, as well as Besant and Ledbetter's thought form, would have served as important sources for Kandisnky's ideas about the visualization of thought and of spiritual transfer, and of the visualization of music. In other texts, both Besant and Ledbetter also wrote about notions such as astral octaves and astral harmonies. And on the higher spiritual plane, they described an infinite number of scales, melodies, and harmonies were possible. Now, while Theosophists would eschew the empirical approach of scientists like Wundt, whom they actually criticized by name at one point, they nonetheless applied these scientific models of the physical world to their spiritual descriptions. And they did draw heavily on some contemporaneous scientific discoveries and theories, especially in the sphere of what might be called occult-oriented science. And there's really a range here. On the more establishment side of things, a prime example is Sir William Crookes. Crookes was a well-respected scientist who proposed vibrations as a means of psychic transfer or telepathy. And his table of vibrations was often reproduced in both scientific and spiritual literature at the turn of the century. It was first put forth in his 1897 presidential address before the Society of Psychical Research, but the following year Crookes served as president of the prestigious British Association for the Advancement of Science. His knighthood also indicates his standing. In his address before the society, Crookes stated, "Ether vibrations have powers and attributes equal to any demand, even to the transmission of thought." Crookes' table of vibrations was also reproduced by astronomer Camille Flammarion in one of his many popular science texts, L'Inconnu, The Unknown of 1900. And Kandinsky mentions both Crookes and Flammarion On the Spiritual and Art. This chart is intended to show the small portion of ether wavelengths that had been identified by science. X-rays had only been identified the previous year in 1896. And for scientists like Crookes and others, such as Sir Oliver Lodge, the discovery suggested other untapped energies of different vibrational rates. This was one of the driving forces for abstract art. If visible light only represents a sliver of the world around us, art should be concerned with invisible realities, not naturalism. Crookes' table was also frequently cited in spiritual and occult texts for the same reasons. In addition to articulating the era's interest in unseen realities, Crookes' table is notable for the connection made between various wave vibrations, including, again, light and sound. Although, again, this would prove incorrect. Sound is not part of the electromagnetic spectrum that includes light. Flammarion adopted Crookes' table and applied the term octave for the double rates of all vibrations. Now, all of this was significant in Kandinsky's model of spiritual and artistic transmission. Flammarion also expressed the idea of psychic transmissions and the notion of an evolving consciousness in terms that would have appealed to Kandinsky. Flammarion wrote, "If we had other chords in our lyre, 10, 100, or 1,000, the harmony of nature would be transmitted to us more complete than it is now by making these chords all feel the influence of vibrations." For Flammarion, consciousness was held back by a limitation of our receptive capabilities. But Kandinsky held that the problem also lay in the lack of suitable stimuli. And on the spiritual in art, Kandinsky wrote, "It is because of the elementary stage reached by our painting that we are so little able to grasp the inner harmony of true color and form. The nerve vibrations are there, certainly, but they get no further than the nerves because the corresponding vibrations of the spirit that they call forth are too weak." Flammarion was probably one of the most prominent popularizers of science at the time, but only one of countless figures looking at the possibilities of psychic emanations of various sorts. And many of these publications were in Kandisnky's library and cited in his own writings. Gustav Wilhelm Geismann suggested the psychical transformation offered by dissonant music in his Magnetism and Hypnosis of 1895, which Kandisnky owned. Geismann was trained in chemistry. He was active in theosophy. His theories were firmly rooted in Franz Anton Mesmer's mesmerism, an idea of the magnetic force of living beings, vibrations in the ether. This in turn provided much of the basis for the practice of hypnosis. Now, Geismann's experiments involved testing and describing how vibrations transmitted electrically, say by microphone, could induce muscle contractions in hypnotized patients. For Geismann, this was one of many demonstrations of the fundamental link between waveforms identified by science and biological emanations biological emanations suggested by Mesmer. Geismann also wrote specifically about music and experimented with different stimuli that might affect his hypnotic practice. He suggested that weakly played, quote, disharmonious tones are preferred in maintaining the hypnotic state to strongly sounded harmonious ones. And this notion of a positive dissonance linking oral and psychic reception was becoming increasingly prevalent at this time. For instance, Colonel Albert de Rochat, French historian, military engineer, Chevalier in the Legion of Honor, and parapsychologist, argued in his 1895 publication, L'extériorisation de la sensibilité, quote, if we can accept that the various bodies are condensations of this hypothetical ether, the basis of all matter, it is true that our sensations are caused by vibratory movements. This substance, designed for transmitting to the spirit the sensations of the body, and to the body the orders of the spirit, has received the name astral or etheric body. Now, Rochat's text recounted his own experiments concerning possible relationships between music and movement in hypnotized subjects, where he examined the effects of music on this exteriorized sensibility. So hypnotized patients were told they would not remember what music was played, only the sensations they experienced. And Rochat studied the subjects' physiological reactions while under hypnosis and recorded their descriptions afterwards. Now, many of these findings seem largely associative and what you might expect. So, music in the, major keys was happy. Minor was sad. But Rochat also drew on Helmholtz's study of dissonance, describing dissonant intervals as having proportions larger in numbers that were more difficult to understand. And Rochat wrote that dissonance was still capable of creating beauty if striking, quote, intelligent ears. In studying reactions to different musical compositions featuring expressive dissonance, Rochat seems to have found his most dramatic results in two now familiar musical sources, Gounod and Wagner. For instance, he uses Gounod's Faust, 1859, to illustrate the penetrating tones of the mediant interval used at significant moments of the work. Wagner's music, especially his Ring Cycle of 1876, was also a regular of Rochat. And of course, these two composers featured prominently in Besant and Ledbetter's thought forms in 1900, 5 years after Rochat's publication here. Like some of the more avant-garde composers of the following decades, Rochat was even suggesting an expanded view of consonance through what he considered the advanced perception of, quote, the true artist, arguing that artists were often capable of advanced perception. Now, Kandisnky's theories also suggest parallels to those of Hippolyte Baraduc, the French physician and neurologist who is best known for his so-called thought photographs. These cameraless images were frequently reproduced in occult literature, supporting ideas about astral manifestations of various sorts. Baraduc described the fluidic, invisible emanations of the soul, or a vital force. For Baraduc, it is that which models the body and is the creator of form. And this was similar to notions of emanating human forces proposed by Ruscha. And like Rusch's notions, for Baraduc, the concept was rooted in the tradition of Franz Mesmer's animal magnetism, later mesmerism. And all of this was really rooted in early 19th century scientist Baron Dr. Karl Ludwig von Reichenbach's theories of what he called an odic force. So there's a rich history here, but I'm going to keep moving. Now, in Baraduc's 1896 publication, The Human Soul, Its Movements, Its Lights, and the Iconography of the Invisible Fluid, Baraduc included a chart of various vibration rates where, quote, vibratory movement passes outward in waves, being spread at a rate of 64 to 73,000 vibrations a second. The chart goes on to define the vibration ranges of sound, obscure heat, light, and photochemical effects of photography at the highest range. Baraduc then proposes that a luminous classification will one day be made of the modes of the vibrations of movement, including those projecting from the human body. Baraduc further refined this notion of emanating human forces in his 1904 publication, Vibrations of the Human Vitality. He said, these biometric vibrations occur, in a word, as in acoustics. When the ear is put in the presence of correct or false notes, they cause repercussions in us, a pleasant consonance or painful dissonance. But then charting the various biometric vibrations, Baraduc concluded that vibration rates in multiples of 10 contribute to health, while those vibrating in the odd multiples of 5 are unhealthy. For instance, the 10th degree represents a life of good instincts and good naturalness. Other positive traits appear further up the scale in multiples of 10, family spirit and fruitfulness, logic, reason, and science, moral order at the 40th degree, and piety, religiosity, and veneration at the 50th. In contrast, sorrow, 15, trouble and irrationality, 25, imagination and insanity at 35, and at 45, obsession, telepathy, and sympathy are among these disharmonious vibrations. So a key point for our purposes here is the underlying basis for this model in acoustics and sympathetic vibrations, but especially this relationship drawn between dissonance and telepathy, suggesting, again, dissonance's transformative and transporting power. So all of these ideas appeared to be embodied in Impression 3, Concert, 1911, as well as within the extended metaphor Kandisnky uses in On the Spiritual in Art to describe his model of spiritual transmission through painting. And it's the central argument of the text, and it's repeated in variation 3 times. Again, generally speaking, color is a power that directly influences the soul. Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with many strings. The artist is the hand that plays, touching one key or another to cause vibrations in the soul. It is evident, therefore, that color harmony must rest only on a corresponding vibration in the human soul, and this is one of the guiding principles of the inner need. It's not difficult to think of Kandisnky and his artistic companions, Franz Marc and Gabriel Munter, as the radiating forms in the foreground, their physical bodies reflecting the spiritual and psychological transformation enabled by the transporting power of dissonance, drawn up and into the piano's etheric emanations. As artists, they would have been especially capable of vibrating in sympathy with the music and creating their own creative undulations, as asserted in much of the literature Kandisnky read and cited, and which is reflected in his own writings. The interaction of sound and figures in the work may, in this way, be seen as a metaphor for Kandisnky's goals for his paintings. The vibrations interact with the audience, who are uplifted and radiate their own sympathetic spiritual vibrations. While Impression 3 does not reflect Schoenberg's methods, it's an important embodiment of many of the ideas expressed in On the Spiritual, and it also marks the start of his serious consideration of the musical concept of dissonance and atonality, especially its acoustical justification in the Overtones series. This becomes even more apparent in his subsequent publication, Der Blau-Reiter, the Almanac of 1912, which Kandisnky co-edited with Franz Marc. It includes essays by music theorists of the Russian avant-garde, Leonid Sabanev, Nikolai Kulbin. Sabanev wrote on Scriabin's Prometheus, and Kulbin contributed an essay in support of what he called free music, which included atonality and microtonality, or more than 12 tones between the octave are used. The publication also included an essay by Schoenberg, musical scores by him and his students, Anton Webern and Alban Berg. A common feature throughout is the idea of an expansion of harmony through an extension of the overtone series as described by Helmholtz. Returning to our initial question, how exactly did dissonant atonal music serve as a formal source for Kandinsky's early abstractions? In answer to the question, we'll move ahead 1 year to Kandinsky's last major painting before the war, Composition 7 of 1913. Having established Kandinsky's vibrational model and his investment in the transformative effects of dissonance, I'd like to now look at the major motifs in this painting, two of which scholars agree upon, and one that's been the subject of various interpretations. Now, these are the last vestiges of the veiled and stripped forms as described by Long. So two are clear. The boat, a symbol for the great deluge from the Christian Bible's Book of Revelations, an emphasis of theosophist, anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner. The Genesis flood narrative, a great sweeping away followed by renewal. The second hidden form is a trumpet, Gabriel's horn on Judgment Day. It's far more evident in studies than in the final painting. The third symbol here, scholars have identified this concentric circle form as the subject of various interpretations. Peg Weiss, Kandinsky scholar, draws connections to the Sami culture, which spans northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia. Specifically, Sami drumming, shamanistic drumming. And this is a compelling argument. Now, Rose Carroll Washington Long proposes that these concentric circle forms, this motif, is part of what she calls the Garden of Love, or Paradise motif. And she connects it to his interest in communal anarchism. It's a complicated argument, but it's highly compelling. And each interpretation is also consistent with the artist's own comments on the circle, many of which relate it to his earlier horse and rider, or St. George motif, which for Kandinsky signified the triumph of spirituality over materialism. I would argue that the concentric circle motif means all of this and more. These various meanings coalescing around the issues that I'm describing in this talk. This kind of pluralistic reading is also very much in keeping with Kandinsky's own ideas. In notes related to this form, he cites the Berlin theater critic and theorist Fritz Mautner, whose philosophical ideas align with much of what I've been discussing, and whose linguistic ideas in many ways would prefigure Fernando de Saussure's an idea that all language is arbitrary. Now, this was central to Kandinsky's poetry at this time, which he published in the book Klange, Sounds. Now, this is a whole other line of inquiry, so I'm going to leave that there for this talk. But Mautner, it really is fascinating, if ridiculously difficult at times. But the point is, this pluralistic meaning was something that Kandinsky was very much engaged with at this time, and would have very much encouraged, I think, in a reading of a visible symbol, especially at this moment in which he's trying to break through, to divorce it from representing something from the visible world. Now, these notes and other material produced in the run-up to Composition 7 offer an abundance of clues, especially within the larger context we've been looking at. This notebook page proved especially important. It's referred to as Observations on Color Theory and Sketches. I call it the Koken note. It's a term he uses in it. translated as boiling usually, but in German it was also a term used in chemistry. And Kandisnky here is actually talking about a fermata form, a fermata, a musical symbol indicating a held element, either a note or a rest. And the timing of that hold is at the discretion of the performer or conductor. So he writes, rough translation here, boiling at the boundary, the fermata is formed, promising contact with inhibition. Can desperation heighten? This remote boiling sends broadcasts over the fermata, from the fermata, powerful sloping, from the fermata, exhausted falling. Now, this seems to be related to a short essay of late 1912 that Kandisnky wrote, Painting with White Border, where he's talking about this inner boiling, once in reference to a, quote, egg shape, which caused dimly perceived vibrations or overtones to awaken in the soul, end quote. In his earlier note here, or in the other Koken note, he also says it must have a core, using the term Kern, which can refer to the nucleus of an atom as well. On the verso, this Beispiel note, for example, he begins, he has two squares, each with a series of concentric circles. Underneath, Kandisnky's text directly ties the concentric circle form to the concept of musical dissonance. He writes, outer disharmony equals inner harmony. He further describes the necessary core as having, quote, an inner dissonance, especially powerful, the mysterious brown, what lives hidden there, a hidden force, inner boiling. This brings the inner spot of harmony, which is only explained internally, not outwardly. It can be a conventional disharmony, but inwardly perceived as harmonious, end quote. The colors he describes throughout this note also seem related to those in Composition 7. So there is a rich cache of related material here. Now, I kept coming back to two of Kandisnky's published statements. Music is the best model, 1911, and I do not want to paint music. So we don't want to try to overlay, say, Schoenberg's 3 piano pieces or any specific piece of music with Composition 7, let's say. But what is Schoenberg's underlying justification? And what is his compositional method? Well, we've looked at the underlying justification. It's the overtone series described by Helmholtz and the idea of more remote consonances. Now, looking at color, and there's a long and rich history that Kandisnky participates in connecting sound with color, rhythm with form. Looking at color, he's specifically talking about overtones in this note. This is his most basic color study of the period, leading up to Composition 7, the most basic study that I've seen of this period. If we compare this to the overtone series, it gives us this, a near perfect match. Now, overtone series actually vary by instrument, so it's part of what makes instruments sound different. So there's some wiggle room, but the basic primary intervals within the overtone series are the same, and they're all represented here. Note the central colors. The basic consonant intervals are the primary colors, yellow, blue, and red. He's consistent in his ordering, and with secondary colors too. Kandisnky continued to experiment with these color intervals while making studies for Composition 7. Note this change of colors used in the central concentric circle motif. We also have photos of the final composition in process, where this central form is at the start, and these others come next. Now let's consider Schoenberg's general compositional method at this time. It's his early atonal period, so his better-known serial 12-tone method would come later. Here, Schoenberg actually uses a traditional sonata form. It's got an exposition in the first movement, a development in the second, and a recapitulation in the third. Follows a traditional sonata form. But the difference is that he's not using a root tone or key in the place he starts and returns. Instead, he's introducing his own organizing units. And these would be what musicologist George Pearl calls cells, small sets of intervals that are in this case, highly dissonant in the traditional sense. So where dissonance would previously be disruptive, it's now the constructive element within the piece. Using 3 piano pieces as an example, cell A is made up of the first 3 notes of the work. Cell B comes shortly after in measure 4. Schoenberg then modifies these cells through various formal processes. For instance, inversion, flips the inversions. Inversion where he flips the intervals. Retrograde, where he reverses them. Retrograde inversion, where he's doing both at once. He also expands the cells by establishing and then developing symmetrical relationships between the intervals. So this is all very different than the traditional tonal key signatures, but it's not at all chaotic. Kandisnky seems to have taken an analogous approach to composition 7, where an initial cell is established and modified, for instance, reversed, elsewhere in the composition, and set against a second cell, related but different. Composition 7 represented another grand synthesis of Kandisnky's ideas, and the constructive and transformative concept of dissonance played an important role. Dissonance might serve as a means of disruption, but a necessary disruption, and one that simultaneously provided the foundation for new ways of relaying meaning through formal relationships. Now, this isn't to say that Kandisnky developed a formula for abstraction, or even that he kept to the approach that I've just described. He didn't seem to. But this was a key breakthrough in his quest to make meaningful paintings without recognizable subject matter. Composition 7 of 1913 realized fully an idea that he was pursuing at the time of Impression 3 concert, 1911. Kandisnky incorporated positive notions of dissonance into existing vibrational models of transmission from other disciplines, such as music, science, occultism, and philosophy. I didn't even get into Schopenhauer and Nietzsche here. For Kandisnky, the effect of an outer dissonance creating an inner harmony that he sought in his paintings would charge the dynamic he repeatedly described in a variety of ways, where spiritual, artistic, sympathetic vibrations and the color overtones of a painting could cause vibrations in the soul. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you'll check out some of our related video offerings, the Music in the Museum concert of Schoenberg's Opus 11, our Gallery Talk series on the Cycle Carré, the International Spirit of Abstract Art exhibition, and there'll be lots more to come, featuring our other galleries and exhibitions too. I'd like to again thank the Dower Foundation, whose generous support made this program and the related exhibition possible.